ever sit and wonder, when did teenagers start becoming a thing? Well, I'm going to answer that question right now. And I'm also going to tell you about how teenagers have greatly changed over the past years since they started. This for a school project, by the way. First, let's go back to when it all started. Around the late 1950s to early 60s, there was a huge thing happening where teenagers were dominating America. I think it was 1965 that teenagers were over 40% of the American population. This was all because of the baby boom. They had tons and tons of babies right when the economy was going up. So all these babies grew up, bam, there's a ton of teenagers all at once. And that might make you think, why weren't teenagers a thing before the 50s? Well, that's because before then, teenagers could not afford to go to school. Well, some could. A lot of them had to work, be in factories as a teenager, and they didn't really get to enjoy their youth. And since the 50s was right after World War II, we were booming in that economy, we were able to have teenagers go to school. Not to mention the technological advances at the time that led to less factory workers being needed, and also television became much more accessible at this time. That leads me to my first piece of evidence about how the teenager really started, and that is the movie Rebel Without a Cause, starring the one and only James Dean, and is one of the first movies that really depicts the teenager and the teenager experience. Another thing that really correlates to teenager experience is music, and Chuck Berry's 1957 School Days really talks about being a teenager back then. The typical teenager experience, going to school, listening to rock and roll back then, teen love. Also another big factor, let's be honest, profits, money, capitalism. In the eyes of moneymakers, what are teenagers? Another demographic to sell to. So around this time, ads, TV shows, things like that start popping up targeting towards teens. Like here we have this 7-Up ad targeting towards teenage girls having a nice little sleepover. It can also be seen by a lot of the artists popular at the time because the artists that were popular were the artists that were liked by teenagers. Another big part of teen culture back then was cars, and this was all due to the fact that teens were having more fun and they had more disposable money because the economy was doing better, so they got cars. From around the 50s to the 80s, having a car was a very important part of being a teenager in America. Now let's go decade by decade talking about the changes with teenage culture in America. First off, 1960s, okay? We have the Beatles. Teenagers loved the Beatles because they represented the relatability that teenagers were wanting, and this is still the time when teenagers were almost the majority of American population. So they needed someone to look up to. Bam, you got some casual dudes. And you might be like, what's so different about that from the 50s? Well, in the 50s we have, say, Elvis. Elvis, he's very shiny, very much more of a caricature. He was a bit older at the time too, and he was something you couldn't be Elvis. But the Beatles seemed like a more attainable thing, like they were more relatable. You could start your own garage band back then, and it was in your mind, I can do that. Yeah, but before this time, most of the music artists were more manufactured by companies. They weren't as natural as this. They also influenced the fashion. The Beatles influenced fashion with teenagers because teenagers look up to idols. Now we have the 70s. What's in? Skating. Skating started popping off with teenagers, especially in California, because around that time, California was having a lot of droughts, and then there's just all these empty pools. What did teenagers do? They turned these pools into skate parks. Skater culture was going up. Another thing that was becoming more popular was punk rock culture. Teenagers were craving a anti-establishment and more messy feel, so they gravitated towards punk rock. This can also be seen with the fashion at the time, how teenagers were going away from how they were before with the prim and proper button-up shirts in the 50s and 60s, and we're going to a less uniform with the bell bottoms and the long unkempt hair. Also, the 70s were the peak point of unsupervised teens, which is why teens had way more independence at this time, and there was way more drug and alcohol use, and hitchhiking was very popular for teenagers. Now let's move on to the 80s. There honestly wasn't too much change with teenagers in the 80s, mostly their hangout spot. The new hangout spot of the 80s was malls. Go to the mall with your friends, you got arcades, you got theaters, you got food court, you could go rent a tape. The mall was the place to be as a teenager in the 80s. And the music, we have Madonna and Michael Jackson, and a lot of the superstars are influencing the teenagers' fashions at the time. One of the most major changes of the time for teenage culture was consumerism. Consumerism was going pew up in the sky. In the 80s, female youth alone was spending over $8 billion on fashion yearly. You know most of the fashion trends at the time. You had the neon stuff, you got the high top sneakers, you got your acid wash jeans, you got your jean jackets. Now we're in the 90s. I didn't know what to put in the background, so we have Kurt Cobain. The 90s was the time that teenage culture was going from a physical world to a digital world. We have the grunge movement with Nirvana and Pearl Jam. Basically, teenagers in the 90s were just saying a big F you to the 80s with their neon and consumerism. The anti-consumerism idea with teenagers is greatly seen with their fashion because a lot of their clothes back then was thrifted and they liked oversized clothes, and ripped jeans started becoming popular. They wore it as a statement of like anti-fashion. It was very popular at the time. And if you pay attention, a lot of these fashion trends throughout these decades still influence teenagers now. Something you might not think about too much, or I didn't think about until I was doing research for this project, is cliques. Cliques in high school, they were not really developed until around the 90s. This is around the time when they started actually becoming a part of the teenage experience. You got the jocks, alternatives, skaters, preps, stoners. Also, computers started becoming more accessible for teenagers. And you know what's on computers? AOL. AOL was the place for teenagers to talk to other teenagers without your parents being like, "What are you doing?" Because before things like AOL, teenagers didn't have a way to talk to each other without their parents listening and at home, because like all they had was the landline, and so their parents could just pick up the landline and hear what they're saying. Next up, we have the 2000s, my personal favorite of teen culture. Social media was popping off when we got Facebook and MySpace in the picture. You get to rank your friends, make cutesy little profiles. You got social dynamics started being defined by social medias. Also, the rise of Apple. You have an iPod, you have an iPod, you have an iPod. Every single teenager's getting their little iPods. Thousands of songs in your pocket. Pew. And at home, you got your CDs and your radios. And the music artists, we got Britney Spears, we got Beyonce, we got Justin Timberlake, Christina Aguilera, we got Eminem, Jay-Z. The 2000s was also the time of the texting boom. Flip phones were skyrocketing in popularity. And slider phones if you're cool. Texting and teenagers start becoming associated with each other. 24/7 communication with your friends, and all you had to do was type it out on a little thing. Crazy. Texting started becoming the primary language for youth culture. That's where we got TTYL, LOL, BRB. It was another chance to have constant communication with your peers without your parents snooping. And now we enter the 2010s. Smartphones start becoming the norm. Every American teen has a smartphone now. Teens no longer were stuck on their computers, now they were stuck on their smartphones. It was basically a tiny pocket-sized teenage ecosystem. And more short-form social media started popping up. We got Instagram, Snapchat, Vine. It was the rise of short video updates. And loop photos. If you know, you know. This around the time that youth culture started becoming highly visual and aesthetic-driven. It is also the time of the big drop. The big drop was a time when we had a big fall in the amount of teenagers going out to hang out with their friends physically. Driving, going out for the night, no more. Which also led to the sudden spike of teen culture being associated with things like anxiety, sleep deprivation, and loneliness. Teens were spending more time scrolling on their social medias than going out with their friends. And now we're at today, which is basically all the changes to the 2010s, but times 10. Teen culture is no longer run by radios, television, or your friends like it was in the past. Now it's run by social medias like TikTok's For You page. Since everyone constantly has unique experiences and feeds, the teen experience is no longer one unified thing. It becomes much more unique from person to person. Thousands of micro-communities to split into. Also, the hyper-isolation making teenagers leave their house less. getting into cars and going into public spaces with your friends less than any other generations before. However, it's not all bad. Teenagers have never been more globally connected than they are right now. Also, we had COVID in the 2020s, which greatly impacted all these. Thank you for watching. Bye! Comment down below